Talk about this idea of artificial intelligence for a few minutes. From time to time, we have talked about this issue of artificial intelligence. We did kind of a deep dive a couple of weeks ago. I have a booklet coming out, so those of you that are donors to Point of View will be receiving it in the mail. It has not been printed, but it will be out in a few weeks or less, and then you will be able to read some of the thoughts that we've been able to put together on that. But it thus brings us to a very important question that was raised just the other day in a newsletter that I certainly do recommend to you, and that is, can machines actually create art? That's a good question, and that is part of the Worldview Bulletin newsletter that is put together by two individuals that we interview on a pretty regular basis. First of all, Dr. Paul Gould, as well as, of course, Dr. Paul Copan. But Paul Gould got his Ph.D. from Purdue University as Associate Professor of Philosophy of Religion, as well as Director of the Masters of Arts program in the Philosophy of Religion program, all of which are taking place at Palm Beach Atlantic University. He's been on the program many times with us, both in studio and by phone, as we've talked about his book, A Good and True Story, Beyond the Control of God, 6 Views on the Problem of God, and then Cultural Apologetics, as well as a kind of introductory academic book, Philosophy, A Christian Introduction. So he's an individual we call on from time to time, and wrote this particular piece in the February issue of the Worldview Bulletin newsletter. If you would like to read it in its entirety, it's on our website, pointofview.net, and I would encourage you to subscribe to it because I have since its very beginning and found it to be quite enlightening. Paul Gould, thank you for being with us today here on Point of View.
Hey, Kerby, it's great to be back with you today.
You start off with G.K. Chesterton. Can't go wrong by quoting from him. In his book, Everlasting Man, claims that one of many things separate human beings from the rest of creation is that we are created with the ability for art. G.K. Chesterton puts it this way: art is the signature of man. But then you got a picture which was generated by a computer, by artificial intelligence, and so it raises, I think, a pretty fundamental question. Would it be possible for sentient machines to actually begin to create art? And I know you wrote that in large part because it fits into many of the conversations you've been having over these last few years on the whole issue of cultural apologetics.
Yeah, that's right. It's so interesting when you start thinking about how do we have a conversation with culture so that the gospel can get a fair hearing. One of the questions that inevitably sort of surfaces is, what does it even mean to be human, such that we have souls that are in need of a savior? And this whole advent of artificial intelligence and ChatGPT has really put that question back on the forefront in some really interesting ways. And so I was just really struck with Chesterton's claim. Art is the signature of man on the one hand, and then you have these portraits that are being produced by computers on the other hand, and they look pretty good. And so it causes you to wonder, wait, are we unique, as humans? And what about art? And what about machines? Are they unique in the same ways? So, yeah, lots of interesting questions.
Well, again, you talk about the fact that this is a portrait. And first of all, I would encourage all of our listeners, since they might say, well, how good is this? And is this really even close to art? Go to our website, pointofview.net. Of course, you can go to worldviewbulletin.substack.com and find it that way, but it's just easier to find it there. And first of all, you'll see this picture. And, I'm not saying that it's the best particular painting one would find, but nevertheless, if you look at the lower right-hand corner, you will see in a Gaelic script, min G max D e to the substrate, and I won't go through the entire mathematical equation, but basically the individual, if you will, that signed it is the computer. It actually is the mathematical computation or the algorithm. And you might say, well, who would want this? Well, it turns out that they had an auction recently, and it actually sold for $432,000. And by the way, in that same auction, Andy Warhol's print sold for $75,000. So there are people that say, yeah, I'd like to have a print from a computer. And as a result, that sort of raises the ante pretty dramatically, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. Especially, there's this question, what is art? And one answer is, well, whatever the art world says is art. And if this particular print, was sold for almost $500,000, I mean, that's a pretty significant claim to that being something of deep value, right? And so there's all these questions. Why is it valuable? Is it just the novelty of it? Is there something else going on? And things like that. So, yeah, I find it fascinating that this particular piece, the portrait of Edmund Bellamy, I think it's called, and, you're right, it's sort of an interesting portrait, but that it sold for almost $500,000, I think is quite provocative.
Let's start giving the answer. We'll get into a few aspects of that. But the first is that I think most people would accept, although I know there's always outliers and there are always skeptics, that whether you're an artist or a scientist or a philosopher, you recognize that there's pretty much of a connection between imagination and creativity. And I guess there are people that are trying to argue that a computer or AI, ChatGPT, whatever it might be creative in one sense. I think it's more mimicking. But imagination is a different issue, and that's, again, playing into the fact that you've written about this very important topic of cultural apologetics. What so?
Yeah, that's right. So I love this quote by C.S. Lewis has always sort of resonated with me on the imagination. He says the imagination is the organ of meaning. And what he meant by that was that the imagination is that faculty of our soul or that faculty of our mind that helps us to understand the world around us. And that's one important function of the imagination. But, of course, another important function that many people, philosophers, artists have noticed is that the imagination is crucial in creativity and in art and things like that. And, this kind of castle building and fantasy world building that we do in our minds. And so notice, though, the language I use to describe the imagination, I said earlier the organ of meaning, but then I talked about this faculty of the soul, this faculty of the mind. Earlier you said, what would happen if we had sentient, artificial intelligence? There's this thing in the background of all these discussions. What is the nature of consciousness? What kind of thing thinks? What kind of thing imagines? And that's what's sort of at the backdrop of this that I think is going to be super important to kind of unpack a little bit.
Can machines create art? And of course, whether you are interested in that or not, the broader question is how much will these new computers, machine learning, machine language, AI, change our world? And many people believe that it will change it in very profound ways. We do have a booklet coming out, and that may be one of the many reasons why you might want to support Point of View, because we regularly send them out to those of you that give on a regular basis, because it is probably the big challenge that we're going to be facing in the future. One small aspect of that is now that we have some art, and I'll put at least some air quotes around it, that have been generated by computers. And of course, I have also seen others that say, well, we can also have computers generating music. And of course, I remember years ago when a friend and I saw the first Moog synthesizer in San Francisco. Back then, it was pretty much of a novelty. Now it's almost used everywhere. You can begin to see that we are moving into a different world. So, Paul, I think it's good for me, let me do the science and then you do the philosophy, that these portraits are generated. There's actually what's called, and I don't want to get too much into the weeds, a generative adversarial network. And what it is it's an algorithm, and I've programmed computers, and so I know enough to be dangerous. On the one side, you have what's called the generator. On the other is the discriminator, and that is you can feed data in there of portrait after portrait after portrait. According to your article, and I'd never looked that up before, about 15,000 portraits painted between the 14th century to the 20th century. And then you have, of course, a generator making a new image based upon those particular sources of information. But you have recognized that even though we are seeing some incredibly powerful technology, I think we come back to the philosophy, and you have certainly, for two very good reasons, have questions about this idea of whether machines can create art. And the first of those is that you argue that genuine creativity involves imagination, and only conscious things can imagine. That gets us maybe later to the idea of a conscious computer, but we don't have those right now. At least most people don't think we do. But what about that? Creativity really goes together with imagination, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's right. So, it's been interesting, been reading a lot of the literature in the philosophical and theological area related to creativity. And most philosophers who work in this area say that for an act or an artifact to be creative, it requires four things. The piece produced or the artifact produced has to be valuable, has to be novel, and then there has to be this idea of flair that brings about something that's surprising, and then some kind of an agency needs to be involved. And so you need these four characteristics to produce something creatively or to engage in a creative process. And you're right. So what that points to is the fact that genuine creativity involves the imagination, right? Like a machine, an algorithm can churn out something that can pass as art, right? A nice portrait there that can sell for almost $500,000, but there's no surprise, there's no agency, there's no imagination. It's just a bunch of algorithms exploring possibility space, right? And what you get is based on what you feed into the system. All those 15,000 portraits, that they're scanning and working off each other. And so that's what's lacking. And you can of course make things, but to create things requires these other this idea of surprise or flair and this intentionality that of course a computer is going to lack. So yeah, super important that the imagination is involved in creativity.
And again, just use that idea of flair for just a minute before we go to your second point, and that is the unexpected. I mean, of course, we mentioned that this particular portrait that was actually sold in the auction was sold for almost 10 times what it was sold for Andy Warhol. But Andy Warhol is a good example, and many artists, whether of this century or the last or even previous centuries, there was something that led to surprise, an unexpected way, a novel way of painting, a novel way of creating, a novel way of writing, a novel way of composing music. And perhaps we'll have a level of creativity from AI, but I don't think anybody right now in the artistic world has to be concerned that they would be replaced by a robot the way, say, somebody on a factory line would maybe be concerned about being replaced by a robot.
That's right. And the creativity that you do see, in that portrait is based on the algorithm. And of course, that algorithm didn't sort of come into being out of nothing, right? A bunch of humans, creative agents, right, brought that algorithm into being. And so
yes,
even the programmers admit that, this machine isn't really creating anything. It's just following, the algorithm, the code that we inputted into it. So the creativity is there, and that's why it is something of value and novelty, right? But the creativity isn't something of which the machine is an agent, right? It's actually the humans behind the algorithm that were the creative agents there. So even there, we do see the creativity, right? And there is a kind of art, but it's not the machine that did it, and it's the humans. And the programmers would be the first, despite the sometimes loud, enthusiastic voices from journalists about, artificial intelligence creating art. Those who actually do the programming will be quick to remind us that no, there's nothing creative going on there. It's actually the humans behind it that are the creative source.
And that's kind of what you were just saying in your second point, that creativity involves intentional agency. Thus, only conscious agents can create. And again, there is no one there in the machine. And if you look at that from a metaphysical point of view, then you have to begin to think that that's not going to actually provide that opportunity. So anyway, near the end, you talk about the fact that in conclusion, given the nature of creativity involving novelty, value, surprise, agency, and the essential role or near essential role of imagination, creative thinking, it seems that maybe machines will never really create art. They may mimic art, but the real genius behind those products are the computer programmers and their algorithms. People listening to this program heard me say too many times about GIGO, garbage in, garbage out, but creativity in, creativity out is true as well. And so I am at least sufficiently understanding some of these algorithms, I believe, to understand that a lot of that is done on the front end, but we'll see. But I just, before we ran out of time, wanted to not only mention that this article is there for people to read, but the Worldview Bulletin newsletter, we've actually posted all of it. So we have the section which you have written on Can Machines Create Art? You have one by your good friend and our friend, Dr. Paul Gould, on the whole issue of the attempt by atheists to ground human rights into some kind of dignity, which of course I think fails. And so people can actually, in a sense, get a chance to get sort of a sample of what you are producing on a regular basis through the Worldview Bulletin newsletter. But talk about what you are trying to do, because since its inception, we have from time to time brought you or Paul or a variety of other authors on the program to talk about it, because it's another way to address some of these really important issues that we need to address, even though we spend a fair amount of time talking about the day-to-day news. I would encourage people to find out more about the Worldview Bulletin. And how you doing, and how can people subscribe?
Yeah, it's going really well. You can definitely subscribe just by going to the worldviewbulletin.substack.com, I think, or .org, and then you'll find it there. But yeah, we're just, we're helping. I think the conviction that we have is that all truths discovered and all knowledge that we discover somehow point back and illuminate the divine. That's sort of one key sort of bedrock assumption that we bring to our work. And the second one is that, Christians, God doesn't ask us to check our brains out at the door, and that we need to be thoughtful, as you do on your show, with all the different challenges to our faith and the culture, whether it's questions about what does it mean to be human, or gender, or sexuality, or in this case, the technology, and how does that figure into what it means to flourish as humans under the banner of Christ. So yeah, that's kind of the goal, is just to think about things that we see in culture from a Christian perspective, and then to help see how, or show how, all things point to the goodness, the truth, and the beauty of the gospel and Jesus.
Again, I would encourage you to go to that website. You don't have to remember how to get to it. Just simply find your way to pointofview.net. Paul Gould has a very good piece on the argument from beauty, which points to God, which I think is a very powerful argument. It was one of the ones, interesting enough, that Charles Darwin struggled with as well when he looked at a peacock and others. So there's some just great articles, and you can find that again at worldviewbulletin.substack.com. Don't have to remember all that. Just simply go to Point of View and you'll find your way. So, Paul Gould, thanks for writing about very important topics, ones that we need to be thinking about, and maybe, if nothing else, encouraging a generation of young people to say, maybe it's about time to think about going into computers or technology, because we definitely need a biblical worldview there, as we do in every other area of life. So thank you for joining us, and I'm looking forward to the next opportunity.
Thanks, Kerby. It's great to be with you again today.
Thanks for joining us. And I hope you again, I've appreciated all that we've talked about today right here on Point of View.